3:47 a.m. The supply room door separated the ward from a combat zone. Inside, Odin, a 90-pound Belgian Malinois, bled from a gunshot wound to his hind leg. 4 bites logged, 2 soldiers and an MP nursing torn arms outside. Command ordered the dart. Fire from the hallway. Do not enter. The blonde rookie nurse stepped forward. She asked for 2 minutes. The door opened. She sat on the floor and hummed a melody no civilian should know. The growling stopped. Odin limped to her, laid his head in her lap, and whimpered. When the commanding officer demanded how she knew that song, she just looked at him and pulled down her collar. The ink matched Odin's collar, exactly, the same unit insignia, a classified handler program erased from public records, but Odin recognized it immediately. This wasn't a nurse calming an animal. This was someone who spoke the dead language of military canines, who knew the dog on the floor had watched his partner die 12 hours ago in a raid gone wrong. The question wasn't how she knew the song. It was why a former handler was hiding in plain sight, and what she knew about the mission that killed the man she used to serve beside. The raid was supposed to be textbook. Insertion at 0330. No moon, 2 clicks from the compound near the Pakistani border. Sergeant First Class Marcus Reyes had drawn point position, handling Odin for the first time in live combat despite 8 weeks of certification training. They breached the east wall at 0415, following the route Sarah had designed herself 18 months earlier, when she was still the unit's senior canine handler. By 0416, the ambush was already set. Reyes took 2 rounds to the chest before he could signal contact. Odin absorbed the 3rd round in his left hind leg, trying to drag his partner to cover. The femoral artery grazed but not severed, a millimeter separating the dog from bleeding out in the dust. The rest of the team fell back under heavy fire, leaving Reyes dead against a mud brick wall and Odin cornered behind a concrete barrier until a second Humvee could circle back under suppressing fire. That was 11 hours ago. Now Staff Sergeant Sarah Vance knelt on the cold linoleum of the supply room, pressure bandage in hand, the dog's blood soaking through her blue scrubs. She hadn't touched a weapon in 18 months, hadn't worn the tactical vest bearing that unit insignia since the medical discharge that every officer in the program knew was a fiction. She had traded her rifle for a stethoscope, her K-9 partner for 12-hour shifts in the surgical ward, believing she could outrun the person she had been by saving lives instead of planning infiltrations. But the tattoo on her collarbone, the same raven and dagger emblem stamped on Odin's leather collar, marked her as property of the 47th Tactical K-9 Division, a unit that didn't exist on paper and didn't forget its own. Major David Hollis stood in the doorway, blocking the light from the corridor. The investigation officer from Army Criminal Investigation Division attached to Special Operations Command. He watched Sarah with the flat, assessing eyes of a man who had stopped believing in coincidence 3 deployments ago. 3 raids compromised in 6 months. 3 handlers dead or critical. Each operation following routes and protocols Sarah had established during her 4-year tenure as the unit's primary tactician. And now the architect of those movements, the woman who knew every blind spot, every approach vector, every timing interval, was sitting on a hospital floor humming classified handler cadences to a dog she shouldn't have been able to calm. Odin's wound required immediate surgical intervention. The bullet, a 5.56 millimeter NATO round, had entered at a downward trajectory, missing the femoral artery by less than the width of a cigarette paper, but the tissue damage was severe and infection was setting in. The veterinary team stood ready in the next room, but the dog had snapped at every approach, teeth bared, body rigid in combat mode, 4 bites logged in the past hour alone. Command had already transmitted the authorization for chemical euthanasia. Dangerous animal. Unstable for rehabilitation. Security risk. Sarah had approximately 90 minutes before the veterinary officer arrived with the lethal injection and the paperwork requiring only her signature as witness. But Sarah wasn't looking at the clock. She was looking at the entry wound, her fingers probing gently around the shaved fur while Odin whimpered against her thigh. The angle was wrong. She had seen enough gunshot trauma in her years to recognize the geometry of combat. Entry high, descending 30 degrees, powder burns minimal. This wasn't ground-level insurgent fire from an AK-47. The shot had originated from an elevated position, a rooftop or balcony, precisely where she would have placed Overwatch if she were securing the route. Someone with her training, her institutional knowledge, had waited for Reyes to enter the kill zone. She had trained Reyes herself during his qualification period. teaching him the hand signals, the whistle commands that carried through rotor wash. And yes, the specific 8-note hum that triggered a conditioned response in military working dogs trained by the 47th. It was a lullaby only handlers knew, used during the first 16 weeks of bonding to establish trust under stress. Reyes had been her replacement, the handler who stepped in when she left, inheriting her dog, her tactics, and apparently her death sentence. The guilt tasted like copper in her mouth. Major Hollis stepped fully into the supply room, boots clicking on the tile, closing the door behind him with a deliberate snick of the latch. He didn't look at the dog. He looked at the tattoo on Sarah's exposed collarbone, then tossed a manila folder onto the floor beside her knee. Photographs spilled out. Topographical maps marked with her distinctive handwriting, the infiltration plan for last night's raid, satellite imagery of the compound. Staff Sergeant Vance, he said, using the name she hadn't answered to in 547 days. The ambush coordinates match your infiltration schematic exactly, down to the meter. The enemy knew which wall Reyes would breach and when. They knew the gaps in our comms blackout. Someone sold that route, or someone inside compromised it. He knelt, his voice dropping to a whisper that barely carried over Odin's shallow breathing. You wrote the book on this approach, so tell me, did you sell it to protect yourself? Or are you planning to finish what the ambush started before the dog can identify the shooter? Sarah looked up from the file, from the photographs of Reyes's body bag, and met Hollis's eyes. The room seemed to contract. Outside, she could hear the veterinary officer arriving early, the clink of the tranquilizer kit, the murmur of MPs securing the perimeter. She had 90 seconds to choose talk and admit she was the only suspect who knew enough to have betrayed her own protocol, or stay silent and watch them put down the only witness to a murder she was increasingly certain had been committed by someone wearing the same tattoo she bore. Sarah didn't look at the folder. She looked at the veterinary officer standing in the corridor beyond the glass, the silhouette of a man holding a syringe filled with pink fluid, the chemical solution that would stop Odin's heart in 12 seconds once administered. She had spent 18 months learning how to stabilize trauma patients, how to read the subtle signs of hemorrhagic shock, how to calculate fluid replacement rates to the milliliter. Now she used that training to buy time she didn't have. The entry wound is angled 30 degrees downward, she said, her voice steady despite the pressure bandage trembling in her hands. Powder burns on the fur indicate a minimum distance of 15 meters. That's not an AK-47 fired from a mud wall. That's a precision rifle from an elevated position, likely a rooftop overwatch. Someone who knew the route waited for Reyes to hit the breach point exactly on schedule. Major Hollis blinked. It was a micro-expression, barely a flicker, but Sarah caught it. She had interrogated enough detainees in her former life to recognize the moment when certainty fractures. You're telling me it wasn't an insurgent ambush, he said slowly. I'm telling you it was an execution, Sarah replied, shifting her weight to apply pressure to Odin's femoral pulse point. The dog whimpered but didn't snap. And the only people who knew Reyes would breach that specific wall at 0415 were the operations staff who reviewed the mission plan, the same staff who had access to my infiltration schematics. The veterinary officer knocked on the glass. 3 minutes. Sarah ignored him. She peeled back the temporary field dressing on Odin's hind leg, exposing the angry red tissue and the sluggish bleeding that signaled arterial compromise. Without surgical repair, the dog had perhaps 40 minutes before irreversible ischemia set in. You want to know if I sold the route? She said, not looking up. I didn't, but I can tell you who had the opportunity to modify the mission parameters after I left. And I can tell you that if you let that vet put that needle in this dog, you'll be destroying the only piece of evidence that proves it. Hollis stood motionless for 5 seconds. Then he reached for his radio. Stand down the euthanasia order, he barked. Get the surgical team in here now. Full trauma protocol. The revelation didn't clear Sarah. It complicated her. If she hadn't betrayed the route, then someone else inside the 47th had, someone who possessed the same institutional knowledge she did, someone who had worn the same raven and dagger tattoo and learned the same handler cadences. The list was short. 12 active handlers, 4 operations officers, 2 command staff. A family so tight-knit that handlers often joked they spent more time with their dogs than their spouses, bound by classified oaths and the kind of trust that assumes everyone in the room has bled for the same flag. The surgical team rushed in, trailing sterile packs and portable imaging equipment. Sarah didn't relinquish her position beside Odin. but she directed the anesthesia tech with the clipped precision of someone who had done this in worse conditions, intense with sand blowing through the seams, with mortar fire shaking the walls. Propofol induction, then intubate. I want continuous femoral pulse monitoring. If his pressure drops below 90 systolic, we clamp and pack, no debate. As the anesthetic took hold and Odin's breathing slowed to the rhythmic rise and fall of controlled respiration, Sarah began the delicate work of exploring the wound tract. The bullet had fragmented on impact with the dense muscle of the quadriceps, sending shards forward toward the bone, but miraculously sparing the femoral artery itself. She extracted the largest fragment with forceps, dropping it into a sterile basin with a sharp metallic clink that drew Hollis's attention. He picked up the basin, turning it to catch the light. 556 NATO, he said, recognizing the distinctive copper jacket and steel core. Standard issue for our unit, Sarah confirmed, her hands moving now with the automatic muscle memory of a surgical nurse. Debriding damaged tissue, flushing the canal with saline. But look at the striations on the jacket. This wasn't fired from an M4 carbine. The rifling pattern is too tight. This came from a precision platform, an SR-25 or similar. Designated marksman rifle, military grade, not available to local militias. The pivot reframed everything. If the shooter had used military hardware, then the ambush wasn't just compromised by a leak. It was conducted by an American asset or someone with access to American weapons and training. The institutional stakes escalated immediately. CID didn't just have a treason case. They had a potential friendly fire cover-up, or worse, an active operator turned rogue, embedded within the special operations community. Hollis set the basin down with exaggerated care. If you're right, this goes beyond a compromised raid, he said quietly. This means someone in the command structure authorized or conducted the murder of Sergeant Reyes. And if they did it once, they'll do it again. Sarah finished placing the vascular shunt, securing the dog's blood supply while the orthopedic surgeon prepared plates for the shattered femur. Reyes was the new handler, she said, her voice barely audible over the beeping monitors. I trained him. He was good, but he was green. He wouldn't have noticed if someone was shadowing the patrol, if someone had access to the real-time location data from the K9's tracking collar. She paused, her blood running cold. The tracking collar, every military working dog in the 47th wore a GPS-enabled collar that transmitted location back to command, a safety measure for handlers operating in denied environments. But if someone had administrative access to that data stream, they wouldn't need to follow the patrol. They would know exactly where the dog was, and by extension, exactly where the handler would be at any given moment. The collar, she said, turning to Hollis with sudden urgency. Reyes's body was recovered with Odin, but was the collar recovered intact? Hollis pulled out his phone, scrolling through the after-action report. Negative. The collar was listed as damaged in the ambush, separated from the dog. It was left at the scene during extraction. It wasn't damaged, Sarah said. It was removed. Someone took it because it contains the transmission logs, the proof of who was accessing the GPS data during the raid. And if they have that collar, they know that Odin survived. They know there's a witness. The public stakes crystallized in that moment. If a rogue element within U.S. Special Operations was assassinating its own personnel, and if that element had access to classified tracking technology, then no handler was safe. The entire K9 program, a critical asset for counterterrorism operations worldwide, was compromised. The trust that allowed handlers to operate behind enemy lines, the certainty that their own command had their backs, evaporated. Without that trust, the dogs became liabilities, the handlers became targets, and the missions became suicide runs. The orthopedic surgeon tapped Sarah's shoulder. We've stabilized the fracture. He's going to live, but he'll never run combat again. Too much bone loss. Sarah nodded, stripping off her bloody gloves. It was enough. Odin would survive to testify in his own way, through the evidence Sarah had pulled from his wound. But as she turned to wash her hands, the supply room door burst open. A young intelligence analyst, face pale, handed Hollis a tablet. Sir, we just intercepted a communication from a known dead drop used by the 47th. Someone inside the unit just transmitted a termination order. Target is the surviving K9 from last night's raid. Location, this hospital. Sarah looked at Hollis, then at the unconscious dog on the table. They know we saved him, she said, and they're coming to finish what the bullet started. Hollis drew his sidearm, checking the chamber. How many entry points to this ward? 6, Sarah answered, already moving to lock the door. But they won't come through the front. They'll come through the service tunnels. That's how I would do it. The major looked at her, really looked at her, seeing for the first time not a suspect or a nurse, but the tactical mind that had designed the very protocols they were now fighting against. You trained the people who are coming, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Sarah replied, sliding a spare scalpel into her pocket, her nursing scrubs suddenly feeling like inadequate armor. And I know exactly how much time we have before they get here. 12 minutes if they follow standard protocol, 9 if they know I trained the entry team, she said, her voice dropping to the mechanical cadence she used in mission planning. She moved to the surgical cart, unlocking the wheels with a kick of her heel. We need to relocate now. They will not breach the supply room directly. It is a kill box with only one exit. They will cut power to the surgical ward first, then use thermal to identify heat signatures through the walls. She was already calculating vectors, her mind shifting from nurse back to tactician with a speed that left Hollis staring. He helped her lift the unconscious dog, 70 pounds of dead weight wrapped in sterile sheets, onto a gurney. The cardiac monitor squealed as the leads pulled taut, then settled into a steady rhythm as Sarah reattached them with one hand while drawing a service pistol from Hollis's ankle holster with the other. Where? Hollis asked. One hand steadying the gurney, the other keeping his weapon trained on the door. The old service tunnels, Sarah said, pushing the cart toward the rear wall. Built in the 1950s for nuclear evacuation, decommissioned in the 80s, but the blueprints are still classified, and I happen to know they run directly under the East Wing. I helped survey them during a security audit 3 years ago when the 47th was considering this facility for a forward surgical training site. The revelation hit Hollis as they moved through the narrow corridor. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. She did not just know the unit. She knew the infrastructure, the architecture, the hidden veins of the building itself. Sarah Vance was not merely a handler or a nurse. She was the unit's former chief tactician, the architect who taught operatives how to ghost through structures exactly like this one. The lights died. Instant blackness swallowed the corridor, broken only by the red glow of emergency beacons and the pale green of the cardiac monitor. Sarah did not stop moving. She navigated by memory, counting doorways, her shoulder brushing the concrete as she pulled the gurney into a left turn that should not have existed according to any modern hospital map. They are ahead of schedule, she whispered. That means they brought someone who knows these tunnels better than the standard playbook. Someone who taught the advanced certification course. The thought chilled her. In the 47th, only 3 people held clearance to teach the subterranean infiltration protocols. Sarah was one. The other 2 were Master Sergeant David Cole and Colonel Benjamin Vance, her father. The gurney wheels caught on a metal grate. Sarah knelt to lift it, her fingers finding the release catch in the dark just as the sound of soft-soled boots echoed through the tunnel system behind them. Not the heavy tread of regular army. The deliberate, placing silence of operators trained to avoid acoustic detection. 3 sets, maybe 4. Hollis pressed against the wall, weapon tracking the darkness. We cannot outrun them with a dog. We do not need to outrun them, Sarah said, her voice barely a breath. We need to get to the radio relay room 3 levels up. If they transmitted a termination order through the dead drop, I can trace the origin if I reach the main server node. I can prove who gave the kill command. They maneuvered the gurney up a service stairwell, each step jarring Odin's injured leg, the dog whimpering softly despite the anesthesia. On the second landing, Sarah stopped abruptly. A shadow moved above them, blocking the faint glow of the exit sign. Hello, Sarah, a voice said from the darkness. Did not think you would remember the old songs. She recognized the cadence immediately. Master Sergeant David Cole, her former mentor, the man who had pinned her first qualification badge, stood on the landing above them, silhouetted against the green light. He was not wearing his uniform. He wore tactical black, a suppressed sidearm in his hand, and the same raven and dagger insignia on his collar that marked Sarah's tattoo. You wrote the termination order, Sarah said. It was not a question. Cole descended 1 step, his boots silent. 3 raids compromised in 6 months, Sarah. 3 handlers dead. You think that is coincidence? The program is rotten? The handlers are using the K-9s for side operations, drug running, targeted assassinations under the guise of counterterrorism. I could not prove it through channels, so I started removing the compromised assets. Hollis shifted his aim, but Cole did not flinch. Major, put it down. You're in the crosshairs of 2 shooters you cannot see. I am not here to kill the nurse. I am here to kill the evidence. He gestured to Odin. That dog has GPS data from last night, proving Reyes was diverted from the primary route by someone with command-level clearance. If that data reaches CID, it leads back to me, and then to the people I'm protecting. Sarah stepped between Cole and the gurney. You murdered Reyes, I executed a traitor, Cole corrected. Just like I executed the other 2 handlers who were selling mission intel to cartels. Reyes was dirty, Sarah. He was taking payments to divert raids. Last night was supposed to look like an ambush, clean and simple. But he brought the dog, and the dog brought you. The worst turn crystallized in Sarah's mind. Cole was not a rogue agent. He was a vigilante operating within the system, believing he was the only honest man left. And he had come to finish the job because Sarah, the architect of the protocols, was the only one who could definitively prove the raids were compromised from within, rather than leaked to insurgents. You did not come for the dog, Sarah said, her hand sliding toward the scalpel in her pocket. You came for me because I know those routes were not compromised by the handlers. I designed them with variable timing algorithms. The only way to predict the breach points was to have access to the real-time adjustments, which means the leak is at command level, not handler level. You killed innocent men to cover for someone higher. Cole's silence confirmed everything. The gun in his hand rose slightly, not aimed at Sarah, but at Odin. The dog is the witness, Sarah. Last chance. Step aside or I put him down and take you in for debriefing. You will disappear into a black site for what you know. Sarah looked at Hollis, then back at her former mentor. She realized the tunnel above them was not just an escape route, it was a choke point, and she had designed the choke points. You forgot lesson 1, she said softly. Never corner a handler in a space they mapped. She kicked the fire extinguisher on the wall, sending a cloud of white chemical powder flooding the stairwell. Cole fired, the suppressor coughing, but Sarah was already moving, driving the gurney forward with her shoulder, using the metal cart as a battering ram. The collision sent Cole stumbling backward, his shot going wide into the concrete. Hollis fired twice, the muzzle flashes illuminating the chaos like lightning, and Cole went down, not dead, but wounded, clutching his knee and cursing. Sarah did not stop. She pushed past him, dragging the gurney toward the roof access door. The radio relay room was 20 feet away, and beyond it, the truth that had gotten 3 men killed and nearly claimed a 4th. Hollis followed, covering their retreat, shouting into his radio for backup. But Sarah knew it would not come in time. Cole had been right about one thing. The rot went higher than a master sergeant. If she accessed that server, if she pulled those transmission logs, she was not just exposing a killer. She was declaring war on the entire command structure of the 47th Tactical K-9 Division. She burst through the roof, access door into the pre-dawn darkness, the helicopter landing pad stretching before them, empty, the sky bleeding gray at the edges. The gurney stopped at the helipad's edge. Sarah turned to the access panel, typing in an override code she had not used in 18 months, praying it had not been scrubbed from the system. The screen flashed green. Welcome back, Staff Sergeant Vance. Behind her, Hollis emerged, weapon still smoking. What now? Sarah turned to him, the wind whipping her blonde hair loose from its tie, her scrubs stained with blood, her hand steady as she accessed the classified files. Now we find out if my father signed the order to kill me, or if he was the next name on Cole's list. And then we finish what the ambush started, the screen filled with data, timestamps, and location logs. And at the top of the transmission list, the origin point for the termination order against Odin, an IP address registered to Colonel Benjamin Vance, her father logged 30 minutes before Reyes took his last breath. The revelation landed like a physical blow. Sarah stared at the screen, understanding finally that the man who taught her everything, who gave her the tattoo and the songs, had tried to erase her legacy one handler at a time, starting with the woman who knew too much, and ending with the dog who carried the proof. She looked at Hollis, then down at Odin, the dog stirring now, waking from anesthesia, his nose twitching as he caught Cole's scent drifting up from the stairwell. The K-9 let out a low growl, not of aggression, but of recognition. Sarah placed her hand on the dog's head. He knows the shooter, she said, and now we know who gave the order. Let us end this. The IP address glowed on the screen like a confession written in neon. Sarah did not hesitate. She copied the transmission logs onto a secure drive, sealed it inside a surgical glove, and tucked it into her bra, the only place she trusted on a body that had been searched, shot at, and stripped of rank 18 months ago. Hollis radioed for a tactical team, but Sarah was already moving toward the stairwell, Odin's 5-line trailing saline from a portable bag she had rigged to the gurney. They found Colonel Benjamin Vance in the command suite 3 floors below, not fleeing, but waiting. He sat behind his desk in full dress uniform, the silver eagles on his collar catching the morning light that streamed through the window, a pistol placed neatly beside his keyboard. He looked at his daughter not with guilt, but with the exhausted disappointment of a man who had already buried her twice. "You should have stayed dead," he said quietly. "The medical discharge, the quiet life, the scrubs. It was a good death, Sarah. Clean." Sarah stopped 10 feet from the desk, her hand resting on Odin's head. The dog growled, a low vibration that rattled through his chest and into her palm. "You killed Reyes," she said. "But it wasn't just about the corruption, was it? You didn't kill him because he was dirty. You killed him because he was your son." The colonel's jaw tightened. That was the final piece. Reyes had been more than her replacement. He had been the illegitimate child Benjamin Vance had hidden for 30 years, a boy he had pulled out of foster care and fast-tracked into the K-9 program to keep him close, to control him. But Reyes had inherited his mother's moral compass, not his father's ruthlessness. He had discovered the arms deals, the diverted shipments of military hardware that the colonel was selling to private contractors through the compromised raid routes. And he had been 3 hours away from filing his report when the ambush was arranged. He was weak, the colonel said, his hand drifting toward the pistol. "Like you, he thought honor was a shield. I taught him it was a liability." He picked up the gun, not to shoot himself, but to aim it at Sarah. "You know too much. The dog knows too much, and I am tired of cleaning up loose ends." Odin moved before Sarah could command him. Despite the sutures in his hind leg, despite the anesthesia still coursing through his veins, the dog launched himself across the desk with a snarl that filled the room. He did not go for the throat. He went for the gun hand, crushing the colonel's wrist and jaws, trained to exert exactly 300 pounds of pressure per square inch. The pistol clattered to the carpet. Hollis burst through the door, weapon drawn, but he froze at the sight of the tableau. The colonel pinned to his chair, the massive Belgian Malinois standing over him, blood seeping through the bandage on his leg, but his eyes clear and his grip unyielding. Sarah stepped forward and placed her hand on Odin's shoulder. "Release," she whispered. The dog let go, but he did not retreat. He sat between Sarah and her father, his body a living barrier, his loyalty finally fully returned to the woman who had first taught him what protection meant. The colonel was arrested by MPs within the hour, not for attempted murder, but for treason, arms trafficking, and the murder of 3 handlers. The evidence on the secure drive, Tumsmank's bank transfers, and the GPS logs from Odin's missing collar was enough to dismantle the entire corrupt network within the 47th. Cole, wounded in the tunnel, turned state's evidence and confirmed everything, revealing that the colonel had been using the K-9 program as a front to move black market weapons through the very routes Sarah had designed, killing anyone who noticed the discrepancies. 3 weeks later, the surgical ward was quiet. Odin lay on a recovery bed, his leg in a cast, his retirement papers processed. The Army had offered Sarah her rank back, her badge, a new K-9 partner, and command of the very unit she had helped build. She had refused. Instead, she signed the adoption forms that made Odin her civilian dog, the paperwork transferring him from military asset to medical support animal, a legal fiction that allowed them to stay together. She was changing his bandage when her fingers brushed against something hard sewn into the lining of his tactical collar, the one Reyes had been wearing when he died. She cut the stitching with surgical scissors and found a folded photograph and a dog tag. The photograph showed a woman she did not recognize, young, smiling, with Sarah's eyes and the colonel's jawline, Reyes's mother, and on the back, in Reyes's handwriting, "She loved me, he never did. Take care of each other." The dog tag was not Reyes's. It was Sarah's from her first deployment, the one she thought she had lost in the sand. He had carried it with him, the replacement handler holding on to the ghost of the woman he replaced, waiting for the chance to return it. To tell her they were family, to warn her that their father was a killer. Sarah sat down on the floor, her back against the cabinet, and for the first time since the raid, she wept. Odin dragged himself across the tile, cast and all, and laid his head in her lap. She did not hum the handler's cadence this time. She just held the tag and let the dog's breathing anchor her to the present. The past was buried. The corruption was exposed, the dog was alive, and as she looked at the tattoo on her collarbone and the matching insignia on Odin's retired collar, Sarah understood that some units are never truly disbanded, they just change shape, becoming something quieter, something civilian, something saved rather than spent. She stood, clipped the leash to Odin's collar, and walked out of the hospital into the morning sun, a nurse and her dog, no longer soldiers but survivors. The story of Sarah and Odin ended on that hospital sidewalk, but it represents something larger that happens in shadow every single day. Military working dogs serve in absolute silence, their heroism classified, their sacrifices often erased by the same systems that trained them to kill. When a handler falls in combat, the dog does not receive a medal or a flag. They receive a new partner, a lethal injection, or a quiet discharge into a civilian world they were never conditioned to navigate as pets. They are equipment until they are inconvenient. Sarah chose to become a nurse because she understood that saving lives requires a different courage than taking them. She could have returned to the 47th, could have accepted the rank and the institutional power her father once wielded. But instead she chose the mundane miracle of morning walks, of surgical wards, of bandage changes in fluorescent light. In doing so, she honored not just Reyes, but every handler who ever whispered a secret language to a scared animal in a dark room, who ever placed their body between violence and the innocent. We pass people like Sarah every day, quiet professionals who have buried their past so deeply that even their own families never know they were ghosts. They carry tattoos that mean nothing to civilians but everything to those who served beside them. They hum songs that stop violence. They remember the names of the dead so the rest of us do not have to bear the weight. If this story reminded you that loyalty is not owned by governments or purchased with paychecks, but forged in trust between breathing creatures, then stay with us. Subscribe to hear more about the invisible wars fought in hospital supply rooms and desert compounds, the battles won not with bullets, but with patience and melody. And if you know someone who served in silence, who carries a tattoo or hums a song you do not recognize, share this with them. Some songs should never be forgotten, and some heroes deserve to come home.